It only grieves me so to know.
During the early 1930s, the states of Oklahoma and Texas were the most prosperous states, not knowing that a major drought would occur in not only Oklahoma and Texas, but also Kansas and New Mexico, and led the events of the Dust Bowl. Soon after the rain dropped, the water levels in the lakes dropped by at least 5%, and dust started to form and block the sun, which caused over 300 million tons of soil to blow around and be lost from any potential farming in the 101 countries directly affected by the Dust Bowl.
Like a bird you flew away, left me alone in the rain.
The dust in the three states started when farmers were overcropping during the 1920s. The farmers weren't paid as much for their wheat and were forced to farm on the more land and at a much faster rate in order to have good pay. This gave the topsoil little time to settle and become fertile. This overproducing caused the soil to erode and turn to dust, blowing around for 8 years. Children and adults were forced to wear masks and goggles to protect their lungs and eyes from the dust. Entire buildings were buried under the dust, and every task became more difficult. There was almost an immediate failure in crops, which it might be attempting to grow when the storms began to hit. This meant that not only were there dangerous winds, but people were starving. The dust was so bad that people were forced to migrate to the west to escape and be able to find jobs. But the amount of immigrants filled up all the job spots, and the travelers afterwards weren't able to find jobs, and unemployment was still an issue for the farmers.
Within the years of the Dust Bowl, the amount of storms only increased. In 1932, there were 14 dust storms. In 1933, there were 38 storms. In one of the last years of the Dust Bowl, in 1937, there were at least 132 storms, which were also named Black Wizards. Due to the dust, 75% of the country prompted the Congress to invent the Soil Conservation Act in 1935, passed after Congress witnessed a storm that blackened out their home city's skies, which gave farmers money to plant grass, vegetables, and trees to lessen the dust storms by lessening soil erosion. Eventually, farmers knew how to combat with the storms with the new grasses and plant life.
But only God can make.
Even with the Soil Conservation Act, people were still deeply affected by the Dust Bowl, as farmers and other civilians were dying from dust pneumonia. Not only was the dust burying entire vehicles and houses, but it was a constant hazard to people and the environment due to the dusty winds. Over 1 million acres of potential farming land was turning into a wasteland of eroded soil.
Say, don't you remember? They called me Al. It was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember? I'm your pal. Brother, can you spare a dime?
Even though the drought, the farmers kept on working the lands in hopes the rain would return. Even with the hope of rain, it didn't keep the drought from impacting 27 states and 75% of the U.S. California had signs saying, "Okies, not welcome," and the dust traveled all around the U.S., including New York. Not to mention that nowhere was safe when a dust storm came around, since dust particles could get inside houses, further forcing civilians of all ages to wear masks and goggles at all times. During these 8 years, it became clear that the Dust Bowl was the most severe drought in the history of the U.S.
In 1941, when rain finally returned to the Dust Bowl after a decade of dry desert states, wheat and other crops began to rise in prices, and some of the 2.5 million people that migrated from the Dust Bowl returned to farming. There were new policies under the Soil Conservation Act, also known as the Irrigated Agriculture, that would help prevent such an event like the Dust Bowl from happening again.
We goes to wake in the morning, just the dawn of day. We go to wake in the morning, just the dawn of day. Yes, it is.
My stormy weather pal was a fair weather gal who left me alone in the rain. When the skies are clear, I could always find you near.